Okay. Well, we've now heard from all of our plenary speakers, and at this time, what we'd like to do is to basically invite all of our plenary speakers to be a part of a brief panel discussion. So we have time for a few questions. And so basically, I'm going to propose some questions that have come in from the chat from different audience members, and we do invite any of the invited plenary speakers to unmute and respond. If we do have multiple people speaking at the same time, then we'll differentiate. We'll allow one to speak first and then follow up. I'm going to ask everyone to please try to keep your remarks to a minute or less, just to make sure that there is time for as many people as possible to contribute responses to the questions that have been asked. And we do apologize. We know that there are more questions that have been asked than we will be able to address during the session, but it's great to see that a lot of conversation has already begun within the chat. Many of you are actively engaged in answering questions with one another, and we will continue that conversation in the breakout rooms as well. So thank you everyone for being an active and engaged participant. So we had a number of questions that have come in over the course of these plenary presentations. And so I'd like to start with one that was asked more recently, as many of the presentations have addressed the topic of modeling. And so a question was asked about the accuracy. How is it that we check for the accuracy of all of these models that are created, and what strategies are being used for model validation? So I want to open this to any of the invited speakers who may have thoughts and insights from their related work.
Let me, Emmanuel, let me start by saying that for at least some of the predictive analytics models that I mentioned in my very short presentation, the typical way in which validation is done is by validating on a so-called test data set that has not been used in developing the model. So, and performance is measured through a variety of ways. I'm not going to get into the details, but there are notions of sensitivity of the model, specificity of the model, and combinations of these into a single metric that could be used for validation. And another typical way of validating models is that sometimes you even obtain a totally external data set that potentially may have a slightly different structure than the data set that you are using in order to train the model, and you do what is known, at least in the medical world, as external validation. Now, there are, of course, other models, for instance, some of the epidemic models, and I'll let the experts of those talk about validation of those models as well, but in general, matching to data.
Sorry.
Please.
So I did want to highlight something that Sadie started talking about in the chat, but also I think is near and dear to my heart as someone who doesn't usually use data. Validation itself is a question of validation for what use. And so models, I would like to make sure that we discuss very strongly, models are strongly contextualized in the question that they're asking. And some of the biggest missteps that we've had as a community of modelers during COVID is when a model developed for a particular question has been repurposed. Then that leads to both invalid use of the model, even though the model itself is internally valid and valid for its developed purpose, but also can engender some of the mistrust that we've been talking about also in the chat of how people trust models and what they're used for. So as a theorist, frequently, right, model validation is a question of, is it providing useful insight to enable either a foundational understanding or better decision making? But again, that's very strongly rooted in the use case. So I wanted to add that into the question of validation.
I'd also like to add, as not a theorist who does love data, that I think that's also true from that perspective. There was a very memorable experience I had in graduate school in a survival analysis class, where we had spent the whole semester working on essentially model validation, trying to get a more and more accurate model. And at the end, the professor asked, did any of these models tell you that heart is a bad idea for HIV? And I think that's something we miss a lot with our models when we start focusing on validation in a very precise, very, what plus or minus error margin you have is, did the answer that was given to a policymaker or a clinician change based on what you did? And I think that's the thing that we often don't think about, and is something I'm particularly interested in, especially with things like epidemic forecasts, where often our level of certainty is this is not good. And that's as far as we can really safely take a forecast.
I think I'd just like to add that in the modeling part of the universe that I live in, there's often a conflation between model calibration and model validation. Calibration basically is when you modify the input parameters of your data in order to match some observed statistics. Once you've done that, you can't validate against those statistics because you've set your model up to reproduce them. So validation really requires some kind of external, both to the model and to the data used in the model, some kind of external process like Yannis was suggesting, at least for that type of external validation. There are lots of forms of internal validation that I think are really important as well. And we as a community, we know how the sausage is made in this modeling, and how many of us have good unit tests for every single element of our very complicated model. So it's not just that we've got this insane number of parameters going in. It's also that many, many elements of the code are probably unwatched, unknown, whether they're working properly. So again, I think there are just many different levels of validation. At the end of the day, especially for forecasting models, I don't think we as a community do enough of sort of forcing ourselves to validate against a projection that we've made against what actually happened. I think that would be really useful. And I put a little comment in the chat when we were talking about weathermen and weather forecasters, and do they have a little bit more trust among the public than, say, climate change forecasters. And I think the constant feedback loop of forecast, prediction, and outcome validation, which every one of us gets to see every single day. Here's what the forecast was, and here's what the day is the next day. That helps us gain some trust. And we don't do a lot of that in the kind of modeling that we do. And I think it would help with the trust aspect.
So if I can just add a little bit, kind of along the same lines, the models that we look are not forecasting models for viral spread or any type of that kind of models. But we do a lot of machine learning where we make predictions of, let's say, functionality that is present in a particular microbiome. And one way to test whether that's accurate or not is to compare what we expect to get with what we're actually getting. So if we're looking at a human gut microbiome and we see functionality of the ocean in a particular environment, there is something wrong with the model. That's the way we look at it.
Yeah, I could also add a little bit that, some models may perform better at some metrics than others. So having a broad set of metrics, performance metrics, helps compare how different models perform in different contexts. Yeah, that's it.
Speaking of metrics, I think that might be a good lead-in for one of the other questions that was asked. And this was a bit earlier during our first set of plenary presentations. There was some conversation in the chat about the topic of pre-indicators or indicators for the emergence of pandemics. And so thought was, it may make sense to develop a list of these pre-indicators, but there were also some concerns about standardizing indicators in an environment that contains extreme uncertainty. And so we wanted to open up for discussion on this idea of indicators, using indicators in an environment of uncertainty and what can be done.
And maybe I can make some comments, Rashid. I had said that comment around the pre-indicators. I mean, that's a pretty I don't think that's a very deep or thoughtful comment per se, in the sense that it's pretty obvious. I think what we're all looking for, right, in terms of the title of the workshop is how do you identify that something is gonna emerge just as it emerges, or just as it starts to become a problem. So what I think what would be great is if we could present a sort of a time course, a holistic time course, given certain assumptions and certain constraints, because there's so many variables, right? This is such a multi-dimensional, such a high dimensional problem. We have to put some constraints somewhere. So I think someone or a group needs to do some exercise where you really create the scenario of under certain conditions, even how the pathogen crosses over, how it spreads, how it crosses boundaries. And we have, of course, a great example just from this past year, a terrible example, but a really good example. So the question is, what measures would you put where? And I was thinking of it from the sensing standpoint, because that's what will then help collect the data to put in as the variables in these models, to then make those models better and be able to predict it better next time. So where and when would you measure what? What are those pre-indicators, short of testing every person in the world for even one particular virus? How do you go about determining when, how, what to measure for a high priority potential pathogen, for example? So I think that's what we're all trying to drive towards, right? Are there indicators that you can check for really early on? And the analogy I draw is this, like a sepsis or any sort of disease prediction, where you would like to determine how sick a person gets in sepsis. And right now it's actually it's a stochastic process. There is multiple possibilities that a patient state can go through, depending on many factors that we don't even understand, and the person's immune system, the person's all sorts of things about what drugs they've had or not, what exposures they've had. So how can I stratify a patient as a patient walks into an emergency department or to urgent care that I'm not feeling good? How can you measure a panel of markers? It will never be one marker. It'll be a complicated set of markers to predict this is the probability of this person getting to severe sepsis is 80%. And I think that's actually, the field is advanced to a point by collecting lots of data, understanding the biology, developing models of the immune system, all of that the field is getting to a point where there are even companies, right, trying to develop those approaches to predict the patient outcome. So I think we're kind of really talking about that here as a global scale, is that what are those pre-indicators? And is there a set under even some constraints that we can think about that you would that one could implement?
Definitely, yeah. We see even in the chat here, we see others are continuing to comment, right? One note here: emergence routes are not identical, right? Which makes it very interesting for different ways to anticipate the next emergence. So, do we have any other thoughts from our other speakers on this particular topic?
Just
okay, Dr. Bromberg, please.
Yeah, okay. One very brief one. I feel that if we were sampling environments of high throughput, so as I said, subways or maybe hospitals, and looking at this data to try to see if there is any marker of a possibility of something that's going to happen, and then applying all the models that people were talking about here to try to determine what is critical and what is not as a signature, then maybe we could have a system where we don't know what we're looking for, but there is a thing that triggers more looking. And I kind of feel that that's fairly cheap to do. I mean, considering, and probably could produce a lot of data which will need to be analyzed and then eventually give us some output.
Thank you. And it sounded like there was a comment from someone else as well.
Yeah, I was going to say something about, I mean, Sadie's point on these different emergence events are different. That said, the vast majority of pandemics have zoonotic origin, and we know that there are hotspots in the world for zoonotic origin. And what we really need is surveillance. We need boots on the ground. And, you know, this is something that is not politically popular because it seems like it's a waste of money to people who are trying to, you know, cut budgets. And I think one of the tricks is to figure out how do we double up our surveillance efforts with you know, a program like USAID's Predict or something like that? How do we double up our surveillance efforts so that we get multiple benefits out of them? And I think it actually isn't that hard to think of how to extract multiple benefits from ongoing active surveillance in places like the wet markets of Southeast Asia and China, in places like, you know, the human livestock animal wildlife interface in sub-Saharan Africa, right? These are places that we know are hotspots. And so, you know, maybe we can use some of these change statistics because, you know, you do see a lot of, you know, what Nathan Wolfe has called viral chatter, right, at these interfaces. You see a lot of little things appearing and coming and going. You know, if we're really serious about this, this is what we have to invest in.
Definitely, yeah. And I see some more comments here just along the lines of regarding this, some of the issues that emerge when attempting to collect data that could be informative, especially in new studies. There was a comment earlier talking about justifying the costs associated with that novel data collection and being able to get funding for these different types of activities and experiencing the pushback associated with that. So it seems to be definitely a thread within the, at least with everyone who has participated today. And I wish that we had more time to talk about that right now, but fortunately there will be a breakout discussion that is focused on this topic in particular, on sort of the advocacy that's necessary to make some of these efforts successful. So at this point in the agenda, I want to just quickly thank once again all of our speakers and all of you making yourselves available for this discussion as well. We have all greatly benefited from hearing the diversity of perspectives and all of the rich work that is taking place around pandemic prediction. And we look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you. So thank you all again for your presentations, for your participation. I do also want to note that some of those plenary presentations that weren't available, I believe, have been made available. There was a Google Drive link that was shared. So if you haven't seen those presentations yet, feel free to peruse them in preparation for our second day of conversation tomorrow. So thank you again to all of the speakers. At this time, I'd like to turn things over quickly to one of our co-organizers, Nina Pfefferman, once again, actually to the organizing committee for any thoughts that they may have as we conclude this quote unquote morning session here within our workshop. So moving from here, we'll be moving towards our breakout discussions. And I know that some folks have requested access via email. So again, if you are looking to participate in the breakout sessions and you have not received the link to be able to do so, please send an email to those addresses that are indicated within the chat. We'll make sure that we share that information again. But for the moment, I'd like to turn things back over to Dr. Pfefferman just to discuss any concluding remarks related to the theme of our discussion and talk about some of the next steps as we conclude this webinar portion of our event today.
So thank you so much. So I do want to thank again all of our plenary speakers and all of our attendees and panelists. So I realize that everybody has incredibly great thoughts that they've already been contributing and that we haven't had time yet to hear from everybody. And so please do continue to let us know. The themes that I've been hearing already this morning coming out really are sort of more about boundaries of understanding and communication and how we can communicate our science outwards. Today in the breakout sessions this afternoon, we're going to talk a little bit more inwards and internally. How do we cross our own disciplines with each other? I think right now the things we've been talking about are on such a great high level that we do all still understand each other. But hopefully we can dig into where the conflicts might be in trying to understand each other's science in the details that allow us to integrate and exploit these opportunities together. So I wanted to thank everybody, and for those of you who aren't going to join us for the breakout sessions, my apologies if that's because we ran out of space, but please do send those emails. We were hoping to be able to fit in everybody, but apologies if we can't. Please don't give up on us. Do come back tomorrow. We're going to start with a report out of what the thoughts were from those breakout sessions today, but also tomorrow we will revisit some of those topics specifically to capture the voices of people who weren't able to participate today on some of those same topics, and invite that additional feedback tomorrow as well. So please, even if today you can't get in, don't give up on us, come back tomorrow, and we'll have some additional conversation tomorrow about which challenges have arisen from those conversations, and then reframe those thoughts and move forwards together for the field. So this afternoon also, I think, Emmanuel, you might have had a slide that said what the topics would be so that people could start thinking about what those breakout sessions were. I don't know if you have a chance to put that up soon, but also if the other organizers would like to say things at the end of this webinar portion of today's session. Just thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Nina. So invitation to any of the other co-organizers, if you have any remarks. Okay, all right. In that case, just very quickly, with regard to the breakout rooms, so many of you have received an email with the Zoom link prior to today's session. And so please use that Zoom. You will have to leave this Zoom webinar and click on the alternative link in order to enter into a different Zoom meeting where the breakout sessions will take place. And again, so we have distributed once again the email addresses within the chat. So if you did not receive that email with the Zoom link in advance of this workshop, then please send an email if you would like to participate in the breakout session. We have received some notes already that there are folks who registered for the breakouts and will not be able to attend. So we would like to make sure that as many of you as possible are able to participate in those conversations. As Dr. Pfefferman mentioned, and this will be displayed again, once you enter into the Zoom meeting, there are themes associated with each of the breakout rooms. And so once you enter into the Zoom meeting, you'll have the opportunity to self-select which group that you would like to be in. We are asking people, since we are about to go on lunch and we have an hour break, if you do intend to participate in the breakout sessions, please leave this webinar and join the Zoom meeting first using the alternative link. That will give us the opportunity to break everybody into the breakout rooms so that in an hour at 3:30 when we reconvene, we'll be able to start quickly within the breakout conversations themselves. So once you get into the Zoom meeting, you'll have an opportunity to self-select the group that you'd like to be in, with the caveat, if one group winds up being very heavily attended and others are light, we may still move some people around just to make sure that the conversations are balanced. So at the conclusion of this discussion here, we invite you to leave this webinar, enter into the Zoom meeting, and select your breakout group. And then you are free to go enjoy your lunch. So we thank you so much for your participation today. And for those who will be joining us, the breakout sessions will reconvene at 3:30 this afternoon.